Get started. Welcome once more to the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series. Next week, our speaker will be Justin Wood from the USC Department of Psychology, who will be talking about the evolutionary origins of action comprehension. This week, it is my great pleasure to introduce Tom Griffiths from the Berkeley Department of Psychology and Cognitive Science program, who is going to be talking about inductive biases and cultural transmission.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk to an audience of anthropologists. I think before I get going, I should sort of clarify where I'm coming from. So my background's in psychology. Most of what I do is studying how people solve inductive problems. So basically problems where people have to reason from some limited amount of data to some underdetermined hypotheses. And those kinds of problems really show up throughout cognitive science. So anything like learning languages from utterances is a good example of this, where you might get some statements that are in that language, and you have to try and figure out what the abstract rules are that might describe how those things go together. Something like learning categories from examples, like if I might sort of tell you that these two amoeba over here belong to some category, and I then ask you to generalize to some other amoeba that might belong to that category. Or something like learning a causal relationship, where you get examples of, say, the values of two variables, and you're trying to induce what the relationship is between those variables. So I study these from the perspective of psychology, but in terms of trying to figure out how people actually do these things, but also from the perspective of computer science, so trying to figure out how we can make a mathematical description of how people solve these problems. And part of why that's interesting is that these are all problems that people solve much better than computers. So something like learning languages, despite the best efforts of researchers in computer science, people are still the best examples we have of systems that are capable of learning languages from utterances. So if we can try and understand how it is people are capable of doing this, then we might be able to make computers solve those problems too. So what we do in the lab is make these mathematical models, test them out by comparing them against behavior, and the goal is to try and figure out what the things are that allow people to solve these problems so well. And part of that comes down to what we call having the right inductive biases, having the right sort of constraints or assumptions that guide learning in a way that allow people to choose between the many different hypotheses that could be consistent with the data that they observe. And I'll give you some more examples and hopefully clarify that as we go along. So basically I'm going to be coming from the perspective of psychology, and I'm sure that some of the things I'm going to say are going to sound strange from the perspective of anthropology, so hopefully we can work out some of those cultural conflicts as we work through the book. So the way that psychologists traditionally study these kinds of questions is by thinking about learning something like this. That we have a learner who's trying to form hypotheses about things, where the world is providing that learner with some data, and then the learner's making inferences based on those data. But the way that I got into studying something which ends up being related to cultural transmission was by recognizing that for many of the kinds of things that we learn, this picture is wrong. A better picture might be something like this, where the data that you get come not necessarily from the physical world and from your direct experience with that world, but from information which is provided to you by other people. And so what makes this interesting is that in fact those other people have also learned what they know from interacting with other people and so on. So this establishes a process that in the context of language evolution, Simon Kirby's called iterated learning. Language evolution is a nice example of this, because if you're thinking about something like that problem of learning a language from utterances, the way that you might learn a language is by observing the utterances made by another person, and the way that they learn languages was, observing utterances made by another person, and so on and so on and so on. So language ends up being something which is transmitted through a sequence of learners, something like this. This kind of idea, this very sort of simplified form of cultural transmission, where we think about information being passed from person to person, is something that's been studied in a lot of different disciplines. There's a precedent for studying it in psychology, which goes back to the 1930s, where Frederick Bartlett conducted a series of experiments in serial reproduction. The more famous experiments used things like short stories, which were transmitted from person to person. But I like this one because you can get a nice graphic illustration of the kind of thing he was doing. So up in the top left-hand corner here is a drawing that was shown to the first participant who came into his lab. And then that drawing would be taken away, and that person would be asked to draw what they remembered from memory. And then this is the drawing they produced. That drawing was then shown to another person and then taken away, and that next person was asked to draw it from memory, and so on. You can see the kind of game of telephone continues, and what happens is, after a few iterations, that owl transforms into a cat. Right? So there's something going on here where the information that's being transmitted is changing through this process of transmission, where here the process of transmission depends on reconstruction from memory. But this sort of methodology of looking at cultural transmission by studying these kinds of what happens as information is passed from person to person or agent to agent is one that's been used more generally. So there are also examples in animal behavior using what people call diffusion chains to look at things like how blackbirds learn which animals they should mob or attack, and how chimps are capable of transmitting information about how to manipulate these artificial fruits, but basically complicated devices that you need to interact with in order to get food. And the idea in each of these cases is to look at what happens as that information is passed from person to person. So when you start thinking about things in these terms, the questions become one of what we can understand about the process of cultural transmission, and coming at it from this psychological angle, how it is that what's inside people's heads is influencing that kind of process. And that's mostly what I'm going to talk about. But I wanted to say a little bit about how it might connect to some of the more sort of broader questions that we might have about modeling cultural evolution. So in a kind of simplified model of how cultural evolution works, a very sort of standard model based on something like the replicator dynamics taken from biology, you might imagine that what's happening as you're transmitting information is that there are a couple of processes that govern what happens as information goes from one generation to the next. So one of these things is who individuals in the next generation might choose to learn from. And this is something that you could model in terms of the effects of selection or the fitness of the individuals in the previous generation, the cues that you might have about how well they're doing that might guide you to choose who you would learn from. But the second part of this is cultural transmission. So the part where, having chosen who you're going to learn from, what determines what you end up learning from that person. And the idea is that by sort of taking these processes and separating them, we can learn what might be going on in those individual processes and perhaps estimate what the parameters of these models should be like. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk about a bunch of studies that look just at this part of cultural transmission using this very simple kind of model, the diffusion chain model or the iterated learning model, and try and figure out what we can say about that process as part of this larger project of trying to understand, what the ways in which we might model processes of cultural evolution, and the way that we can estimate the factors that are relevant to making these kinds of models more generally. Okay, so what I'm going to do is start with a formal analysis of iterated learning. So I'll just present some mathematical results, and then I'll talk about how we can test out the model in the lab. And then at the end of the talk, I'll just give you some sort of highlights from some work that we've been doing more recently, looking at how you can use a similar kind of methodology to look at the factors relevant to processes like cumulative cultural evolution. If you have clarification questions, feel free to ask them as we go along. I think this is probably a sort of mixed audience of people from different disciplines, so if at any point something doesn't make sense, then feel free to ask a question. Okay, so I'll start with this formal analysis of iterated learning. So I'm going to talk about this in terms of iterated learning because the process that I'm going to focus on is a process of learning, where one person is learning from another person. And the kinds of things that you can imagine being transmitted by this sort of process are things that are inside people's heads, but not necessarily things that you can get direct evidence from interacting with the physical environment. So a good example, like I said, is something like language, where language is something that you learn from other people and then transmit to other people. But other interesting cases are things like perhaps religious concepts, where you might learn what's sacred or holy by being provided with examples of sacred or holy things by other people, and then go on to label those things as sacred or holy for other people in the future. Or something like learning a social convention, where the way that you learn that convention is by observing the behavior of others, and then by exhibiting that convention, you would then go on to transmit it to other people. So something like learning to clap at the end of a talk might be something that you end up figuring out that's what you should be doing when you go to your first talk, and then you continue to model that behavior throughout the future. So one thing that's interesting is that in all of these cases, there's a question that's come up, which is a question about how it is that constraints on learning, what I've been talking about as inductive biases, might influence the outcomes of processes of cultural transmission, or the kinds of things that we see across different societies. So in language, the sort of famous case of this is something like a Chomskyan argument that there has to be strong constraints on language learning, where part of the argument is based on observing that if we look across human languages, we don't see all possible communication schemes that we can see exhibited. We only see a relatively small range of those possible communication schemes. So maybe that's evidence that there's something inside our head which is constraining the outcomes of these processes of diffusion of languages across cultures. For religious concepts, there are similar kinds of arguments based on notions like the naturalness of certain kinds of religious ideas, that in this case, something about certain kinds of religious ideas might make it easier for us to learn or remember them, and then as a consequence be able to transmit them more effectively. And for social conventions, there have also been analyses which have been based on the idea that certain kinds of conventions might more naturally mesh with our expectations, and as a consequence, then we would see those things being expressed in different societies. So this is the kind of question that I'm going to focus on, where it's a question about how what's inside our head might influence the outcome of these kinds of processes of cultural transmission. And I'm going to try and turn this into a mathematical question, and then something that we can study in the laboratory. So the way that we turn this into a mathematical question is by taking this iterated learning setup and then being a little more precise about what's going on. And the way that I'm going to do this is by saying, let's associate each of these steps in the process with a probability distribution. So we're going to have two probability distributions. Probability distribution over hypotheses given data. So the L here means something like learning. So this is denoting the consequences of observing data and then making an inference from those data. So the idea is that in choosing this hypothesis, this agent might observe these data, and then we can specify which hypotheses they would choose in terms of some distribution over hypotheses based on those data. And then another probability distribution, which is about what people will produce, given that they entertain a particular hypothesis. So here the P is for production. And the idea is that there's going to be some probability distribution over data associated with a choice of a particular hypothesis. And then this process continues where this person, having observed data, chooses a hypothesis from this distribution, then generates data from a distribution which is based on that hypothesis, and then generates a hypothesis from the distribution. The next person generates a hypothesis from the distribution based on the data they observe, and then produces data based on the hypothesis they choose, and so on. And so this defines a stochastic process that we can actually then use some tools from statistics to analyze and to try and work out what the answer to this sort of question might be. So the main statistical tool that we end up using is the idea of a Markov chain. So can I just get a show of hands, everyone who's happy with Markov chains?
What if we know what they are but we don't like them?
All right, we're going to be, so I brought some props with me to explain what Markov chains are. So a Markov chain is a sequence of random variables where each variable in the sequence is independent of the preceding variables, conditioned on the one that immediately precedes it. Well, one way of thinking about it is that it's a process where the way that you generate the sequence of values of variables is you just have to pay attention to what the state was previously, what the value of the variable was previously, and then that's going to determine the value of the variable next time with a probability distribution over what those variables would be. So a good example of a Markov chain is a deck of cards. If you're going to be shuffling a deck of cards, so here the variable that we care about at each moment in time is the configuration of the deck of cards. So you can think about each card in the deck being something which is going to lie in one of 52 possible locations. And so there are 52 factorial possible orderings of the cards in the deck, and that's going to be the state space of your Markov chain. That's what your variables are going to describe. So each of these variables at each of these points in time describe what the current configuration of cards is in your deck, right? So when you shuffle a deck of cards, what you're doing is taking the current state of the deck of cards, and then you're using a probability distribution based on that current state to then move to another state. So a very simple kind of shuffle would be one where, say I take the top card off the deck, and I stick it in at a random location, right? So that means that from that particular configuration, there are now 52 possible configurations that I can move to, right? And I'm going to choose those randomly, where the next configuration I move to is going to be randomly chosen based on the previous one. So there's some probability distribution. That's called the transition distribution of the Markov chain. But it's only going to depend on the previous state, right? So which states I move to are going to depend on what state the deck of cards is in right now. Making sense so far? Yeah? So more complex shuffling schemes have exactly the same kind of properties. So if I do something like an overhand shuffle, then what I'm going to be doing is mixing up the cards. But there's going to be some probability distribution over states that I'll move to based on what the current state was, right? And something like a riffle shuffle, same idea. There's some different distribution over states that I moved to based on the state that I was in, but it has the same kind of property that it only depends on the state that I was previously in. As long as you know what that state is, then you can make a prediction about what the next state will be. Okay, so that's the first concept. Now you've got the definition of a Markov chain. So now we need another property. So why is it that we shuffle decks of cards? Hang on, this is the audience participation portion of the talk. What are we doing?
That's three Markov chains?
Yeah. Okay, so that's a good answer. Very context-specific answer. More generally, perhaps, what we might be trying to do is forget about. We're trying to get to a state where we don't know what the distribution is, right? Where we don't know what the organization of the deck of cards is, right? So what we're trying to do is go somewhere where, of all of those 52 factorial states, we have no idea which of those we're in. What's called a uniform distribution over the states of the Markov chain, right? So that's what we're trying to do when we shuffle the deck of cards, is we're trying to get to that uniform distribution. And the problem is that, at least in principle, we start off knowing what the state of our cards is. And we want to be doing something where, regardless of what state we start in, we're going to end up not knowing what the state of the cards is. Okay, so the reason why shuffling a deck of cards works is because of a property of Markov chains called convergence to a stationary distribution. So what this means is that if you follow this transition matrix, each time you sample based on the previous state, and you do that enough times, then over time what happens is you forget about what the original state was. So if you do this for a Markov chain, if it has certain mathematical conditions, which we're not going to worry about, I'll give you some intuitive examples in a moment. If you do that enough, then it'll converge to this distribution, and it'll converge to the same distribution regardless of where it started out. And that distribution is called the stationary distribution. The reason why it's called the stationary distribution is because once you're there, you're stuck there. So if you are in the stationary distribution, say for your deck of cards, you don't know what order the cards are in, and then you apply the transition matrix, then you're still in the stationary distribution. So think about a deck of cards. If you now don't know what order my cards are in, and I shuffle them, nothing has changed, right? You still don't know what order they're in. And so that's what tells you that that's the stationary distribution. Okay? Okay. So you can think about, so the thing that makes a shuffling scheme a good shuffling scheme is that the stationary distribution of the Markov process it defines is one that's uniform over all states, right? So this one where I take off the top card and I stick it in at random, right? That's actually a good shuffling scheme, right? A bad shuffling scheme might be one where I take off the top card, I check if it's red or black. If it's red, I put it towards the top. If it's black, I put it towards the bottom, right? That's not a good shuffling scheme. And it's going to converge to a stationary distribution, but it's not a stationary distribution which is uniform. And there are lots of other bad shuffling schemes you can come up with. You can split the deck up into two parts, shuffle each of the two parts, put the two parts back together again in the same order. That's bad. That violates one of these mathematical conditions for ergodicity, because you can't get to every possible state from every other possible state, right? There are also some other more fancy shuffles that are bad shuffles. We're going to do one card trick. So one of these bad shuffles is something called a perfect shuffle. So a perfect shuffle is a variant on the riffle shuffle, but it's a variant where every card ends up between exactly two other cards. So that's a bad shuffle because if you do it 8 times, it comes back to the original order. It's purely deterministic. Okay. All right, so that's it for card tricks, I'm afraid. From now on, it's just going to be cultural transmission. Okay, so you've got the key idea though, right? If we can show that something is a Markov chain, and we know how to do that, we have to show that it has this dependency structure. Then we have this property of Markov chains that they have a stationary distribution, and we can figure out what that stationary distribution is. And this gives us a way of answering our question about what the outcome of a process of cultural transmission might be like, because we're going to get there regardless of where we start out. So it's going to tell us, regardless of what we sort of put in at the start of the chain, this is the distribution over hypotheses that we expect to converge to over time. And even though, normally we're shuffling cards to get to a uniform distribution, I gave you the example where if you put red cards on top and black cards on the bottom, you're going to end up getting to something which is still a stationary distribution, but it's a somewhat biased stationary distribution. We can look at what the sort of bias is that's exhibited by that stationary distribution that we end up getting to by thinking about the Markov chain that might correspond to this process of cultural transmission. Okay? Everyone's okay? All right, so let's go. So step one is we have to show that this thing that we want to understand is a Markov process. So in fact, if we write out the random variables that we're talking about, the data and the hypotheses, we have this idea that we choose each hypothesis conditioned on data, each piece of data based on a hypothesis, and this has this Markovian structure. You can make it more explicit. You can kind of see that you can make just a Markov chain on hypotheses by, in this case, summing over the data. So there's a way of just working out what's the probability of getting a hypothesis based on you have a hypothesis here, or a Markov chain on data, summing over hypotheses in the same way. but this has a traditional sort of Markovian structure, and then this gives us what we need to do in order to figure out what the outcome of this process of transmission is, based on our specification of the learning procedure that the agents are using, and the way in which they're choosing to produce data. We can then work out for these Markov chains what the stationary distribution is, and that tells us where we're going to expect this process to evolve to over time. Okay? So in order to do this, we actually need to make some more specific assumptions about what those processes of learning and production are like. And this is where the stuff inside people's heads comes in, right? Now we have to make an assumption about what a process of learning or memory or something like that looks like. And so the way that I'm going to do this is by analyzing learning as a form of Bayesian inference. So Bayesian inference is an idea that was introduced in the 18th century by the Reverend Thomas Bayes. It's basically a stipulation of how a rational agent should go about updating their beliefs based on observed evidence. And the idea is that by doing this, we get a kind of model of how it is that rational agents might transmit information over time, but we also get a model that allows us to be explicit about this thing that we care about being able to talk about, which is the inductive biases of those agents, the kinds of constraints that might be guiding their learning. And I'll show you how this works. So the key idea is something which is called Bayes' theorem, which tells us how a learner should go from whatever they believe about hypotheses already to a set of beliefs about those hypotheses based on data that they observe. So Bayes' theorem, if you just sort of write it out like this, is just a sort of tautology of probability theory. Where it gets interesting is when we say that these H's are hypotheses, V is data, and probability is going to be used to encode your degree of belief. So the idea is that what happens is you start out believing in these hypotheses to some extent, and the amount that you believe in them is reflected in a probability distribution over those hypotheses, where you give a hypothesis higher prior probability if you think it's more likely to be true, and lower probability if you think it's less likely to be true. And this is what's called the prior probability distribution. It's prior because it's before you get to observed data, right? The idea is that then what you want to compute is what's called the posterior probability. This is how much you should believe in those hypotheses after you saw the data that you saw. And the way that you get there, according to the Reverend Bayes, is you take your prior probability, you multiply it by what's called a likelihood, which tells you how probable the data you saw would be if that hypothesis were true. And then this bit on the bottom, which looks kind of nasty, all this is doing is summing the same quantity over the space of all hypotheses. So this is just making sure that the whole thing adds up to 1. So the key idea here is this stuff at the top, which says that take how much you believed in something already, and then either increase or decrease the weight based on how well it fits with the data that you observed. And that's going to tell you how much you should believe in something. So it seems like a complicated mathematical rule, but in fact, it's, it sort of seems like common sense. You should just increase your belief in something if it's consistent with the data you saw, and decrease your belief in something if it's not consistent with the data you saw. A simple intuitive example, if you think about something like you want to explain your friend coughing is a nice inductive problem, a problem of diagnosis, right? So your friend coughs, these are your data. You could think about 3 hypotheses you could have about this. So one might be a cold, another might be lung cancer, or the third would be a headache, right? So you can think about which of these different hypotheses seems best. Okay, I'll do something that I use for measuring probability distributions in my class. I want you to hum with an intensity which reflects your subjective probability for each of these 3 possibilities. Humming is very good for class demonstrations because it's kind of hard to tell if someone next to you is humming, and it actually automatically aggregates for us, so we can follow the intensity of humming. It's a linear combination, so it's doing what we need to with probabilities. Okay, so let's start out with a cold. Lung cancer? No. Okay, so there are a lot of consensus there. I probably didn't even need to do an experiment. But what we find, so this is a good explanation, and it's a good explanation because it's something which is medium prior probability, like colds are reasonably common, and a medium likelihood in that if you have a cold, it's reasonably likely that you'll be coughing, right? The reason why these are bad explanations is that they fail on one of those criteria. So something like lung cancer is good in terms of, like, if you have lung cancer, you're going to be coughing a lot, right? So it has a higher likelihood, but it has a really low prior probability compared to something like a cold. Like the extent to which you think it's likely that somebody has lung cancer just walking around is much lower. Something like a headache, right? Probably even more common than having a cold, but it has a very low likelihood because the probability that you cough if you have a headache is much lower than the probability that you cough if you have either of these other things. So Bayes' rule is really about combining together these 2 sources of information, right? The prior probability, how much you expect something to be true before you see the data, and then how well it fits with the data. And this trade-off between fit and plausibility is something that you can generalize to much more complicated statistical problems. So, here's a much nastier statistical problem, figuring out what line best, describes a set of data points. But here, the same kinds of things trade off. So if you look at these black points, you could imagine these come from some function that you don't know. Here are 3 candidates. There's this sort of quadratic function here, green, this high-order polynomial in red, or this linear function in blue. Well, you have the same kind of trade-off where, a priori, you might think it's more likely that, sort of somewhat simple linear relationships might exist between things. But it doesn't do a great job of fitting the data. It's a long way away from these black dots. Whereas, something like this red function does a fantastic job of fitting the data. It goes through all of the data points. But it seems kind of weird, like you wouldn't have expected to see a function like that if you hadn't seen the data, right? And so the green one is a pretty good compromise where it's something that's not too complicated. It seems like a nice sort of relationship, and it does a pretty good job of getting close to the data as well. Same kind of idea, you're trading off fit and plausibility. So the reason why Bayesian inference is useful in the context of the problem that I want to talk about, of looking at the effects of inductive biases, is that it's very transparent about what those inductive biases are. So you can kind of think about it as your inductive biases are those factors which lead you to choose one hypothesis over another when those hypotheses are equally consistent with the data. Well, what does that mean? It means that if you've got sort of the same match to the data, then those factors that sort of lead you to end up with different beliefs. And those factors are things that have to end up being in those priors. So the priors reflect kind of what your expectations are before you get to that learning problem. And as a consequence, they give us a way of thinking about those expectations that learners are bringing and looking at how those expectations line up with the outcomes of, looking at how they influence these processes of cultural transmission. Okay, so what we can do is take our iterated learning setup, and now we have what we need in order to fill in these extra assumptions. We'll assume that our agents are Bayesian agents, so we'll stick in the ribbon base for each of our agents, and then we'll assume that our learners are sampling from a posterior distribution. So the idea is that they see data. Each of our learners has some prior, and I'll assume that it's the same prior distribution for each of our learners. And then what they're doing is applying Bayes' rule and ending up with a probability distribution over hypotheses, and then the hypothesis that they choose is just a sample from that probability distribution. Okay? And it turns out that this actually does all the work that we need to. We can plug in an arbitrary set of hypotheses. We assume that people generate data in a way which is consistent with the hypotheses that they're entertaining, but those could be arbitrary. This does all that we need to in order to actually work out the stationary distributions of those Markov chains. So what we can prove is that the stationary distribution for the Markov chain on hypotheses is the prior distribution. So what that means is that regardless of where you start out your iterated learning chain, regardless of what hypothesis they have or what data they have, if enough time goes on, the probability that a person chooses a particular hypothesis is going to converge to the prior probability of that hypothesis. And there's a similar result for the data. So it converges to something called the prior predictive distribution, which is just what you get when you average those data distributions over the prior. So the key idea here is that this is actually sort of reflecting a strong influence of whatever those things are inside our head on the outcome of these processes of cultural transmission. That we should expect those things that are produced by this kind of process to be in alignment with the expectations or inductive biases that people have. It's worth saying at this point, this isn't a strong nativist argument. Those kinds of inductive biases can be things that come from anywhere. They can reflect, innate domain-specific, knowledge, which is what some people would like them to be. But they could also reflect domain general biases based on memory or learning capacity, or they could reflect factors which are learned from the environment just before you happen to learn the things that you learn. So they could, reflect cultural biases that you've acquired and that will influence the way that you transmit new forms of information. Okay, so why does this happen? Well, one intuitive way of understanding why it happens is that the data here are acting once, and the prior is acting many times. So whatever you start out this process with, that's kind of one little input that gets it going. But then every time an inference is being made, the prior is having its effect. So at each point, the expectations of the person who's interpreting the data are going to have an opportunity to influence the data. And I said the stationary distribution is the distribution you get to where once you get there, you can't leave. Well, you can think about this. What's happening is each time that inference is being made, you're getting a little closer to the prior. And the only distribution which is invariant to that process is the prior itself. So, the only thing that you can't get closer to the prior then is the prior. So once you get there, you'll stay there, and that's why it's the stationary distribution. But you can think about it as just the incremental accumulation of each of these inferences. There's also a deeper mathematical reason, which is exciting if you're a statistician. So this particular Markov chain is something called a Gibbs sampler, and we can use that to prove some other things about the outcome of this kind of process. Okay, so we have a few other mathematical results. So this is sort of a straightforward generalization of this. I talked about chains of individuals where we just analyze a single chain and look at the probability distribution over time. You can easily extend that to think about an infinite population where each person is choosing to learn from one person in the previous generation. And what then you obtain as an equilibrium of that system is one where the proportion of people who are choosing a hypothesis converges to the prior. So this is a more direct way of relating this to something like cross-cultural universals, where it's saying that the probability with which you expect to see a certain property exhibited across cultures is going to correspond to the prior probability of that property. If you move from sampling to maximizing, that increases the effect of the prior. So remember, I assume that our learners are sampling from their posterior distribution. They could do something which is more like choosing the hypothesis that has the highest posterior probability. And when you do that, that actually gives an opportunity for the prior to have an even bigger effect on the inferences that you make, because breaking a tie there can have a sort of discontinuous effect. And so the interesting implication of that is that you can observe strong universals despite having weak inductive biases. So this is a nice point. Simon Kirby, who's my collaborator on this, likes this because he wants to argue that despite observing strong consistency in the properties of languages, across societies, you could have that consistency being produced by a much weaker kind of inductive bias than the kind of traditional Chomskyan analysis of the kind of universal grammar that might be constraining language learning. So this is showing that cultural transmission can exaggerate whatever those weak inductive biases might be. There are some interesting results. So this is a super simple model where we have no social structure. If you make the next super simple model where you introduce a little more social structure and allow people to learn from multiple teachers where they're getting data from both of those, then that has a big effect. It can wash out these effects of inductive biases where really the prevalence in the population is what's driving which hypothesis you end up choosing. But we also have a result which shows that if you can recognize that you might be learning multiple different hypotheses from different people, then you can get back to the state where you get this strong effect of inductive biases. And I'm happy to talk about some of these effects later if you have questions about them. The basic conclusion, though, from these mathematical analyses is that the outcome of this process of iterated learning is going to be something that's strongly influenced by the inductive biases of learners. So hypotheses with high prior probability are ultimately going to appear with high probability in the population. And this gives us a way of getting back to that question we started out with about what the relationship might be between what's inside our head and what the outcomes of these kinds of processes of cultural transmission are like. So perhaps this gives you a way of thinking about how constraints on learning might connect up to cultural universals. And we also have some similar results in other settings where we do things like, instead of looking at just the transmission of hypotheses, we look at the social construction of hypotheses in a context where people need to coordinate. And again, I can talk some more about that if you're curious. Okay, so this sort of set of mathematical results are nice. We had to make a bunch of assumptions and sort of setting up the model in order to get those results. So what I'm going to do for the next part of the talk is talk about some experiments that we've done to test out those model predictions. It's worth saying that part of the reason why this is interesting to me is not just because it gives us a way of estimating some of those parameters of those models for cultural evolution, but because it gives us a new way of investigating what human inductive biases are like. So what this tells you is if you want to figure out what those inductive biases are, they're inside our heads, which is what I want to do. That's kind of my goal as a cognitive scientist, is figuring out what those are and where they come from. Then one way we could do that is by simulating this process of cultural transmission and seeing what kinds of things survive that process. And so we've done a lot of experiments with that kind of goal, but they provide us with another way of testing the predictions that those models make. So in order to do this, what we do is go back to some of those inductive problems that I talked about. And in many of these cases, we have ideas about what people's inductive biases look like. And so this gives us a way of testing out the predictions of the model. We can look at whether we end up getting out of that process of cultural transmission the inductive biases that we know that people have. So one example of this is something like function learning, where we have a pretty good idea from 30 years of research what people's inductive biases are like. So the kind of task here is that what people get is information about the values of two variables, and what they're trying to do is figure out a function that relates to those variables. The way that we do this in the lab, they'll see a set of samples of these two variables. I'll show you the format in which that's presented. And then they make predictions of the value of one variable based on the value of another variable. And then those predictions are taken as the data that's provided to the next learner. So it's worth saying that this, in the context of many of the questions that I'm sure you explore in an anthropology department, this is a very boring and very abstract kind of task. The reason why we're doing this is because it's something which gives us a lot of control over what's going on in our experimental setting, and because it's something for which there's a long literature in cognitive psychology telling us what we should expect people to be able to do on this kind of task. So just to show you how this task works, this is more boring than most of the experiments that I run in my lab, so I'm already sensitive to it being a pretty boring task. The idea is that what you're trying to do is learn the relationship between the width of this bar and the height of this yellow bar. And what happens is you come in and you see 50 examples where we show you the width of this bar, you adjust this slider to move this red bar to the place where you think the yellow bar is, and then the yellow bar appears, and if you've got it right, you go on to the next trial. If you haven't got it right, then you have to adjust the red bar to match the height of the yellow bar. So we do that 50 times, right? That's sort of teaching you about this relationship. And then we have another 50 times where we do the same thing after you've learned the relationship, but we don't show you the yellow bar. So we're just collecting your predictions based on the stimulus that you see.
Training has noise?
Training has no noise, it's noiseless.
No noise.
But it's just done with a sequence of trials so that there's basically memory introduces noise. And people find this really hard to do.
Yeah, I'll bet.
The reason why we use this, despite it being boring, is that there's a very clear ordering in terms of the difficulty of functions to learn. The easiest thing to learn is that as this bar gets longer, this bar gets longer, right? That's really easy to learn. The next easiest thing to learn is that as this bar gets longer, this bar gets shorter, right? And then after that, you have nonlinear functions and periodic functions and so on, and those basically take like many more trials, possibly even multiple days for people to learn, but they can learn them. So we then have expectations about what people's inductive biases are going to be like. Some of these things are easier to learn than others, and that's a reflection of what those inductive biases are. So what we can do is do iterated learning where we use different initial data in our chains and look at what we end up converging to across different trials. So the way I'm going to show these data are now abstracting away from those bars back to just the 2 dimensions. We can start a chain off with a positive linear function like this. This is the one that's easy to learn, and in fact, it seems reasonably easy to learn. These are the predictions that our first learner makes. We then take those as the data we give to our next learner, and they produce predictions like this. Those are the data we give to the next learner, they produce predictions like this. And over time, this relationship gets transmitted faithfully, where people are able to make an appropriate prediction and seem to be able to learn from the behavior of other people. Okay. It turns out that this is the exception rather than the rule. So if you start out with a harder function, like a negative linear function, it persists a little while, but it eventually turns into that positive linear function. And this happens basically regardless of what you start with. Is a nonlinear function or just random noise. And you see the same thing with that positive linear function. So we've done this 32 times with chains of 9 learners. 28 of those 32 times we got the positive linear function after 9 iterations. The other 4 times we got a negative linear function. So this is consistent with a strong bias towards a positive linear function, and then a negative linear function, which is slightly lower probability. We've done a bunch of other experiments, I'll show you some more examples later on, where we have better controls and better ideas of what people's inductive biases are like, and we get out more things which, rather than converting to a single solution like this, produce a distribution of solutions. But some of the more interesting cases are cases where there's actually a controversy in the literature about what the kinds of inductive biases are. So I'll show you one example like this. This is iterated learning of frequency distributions, where we take a very simple kind of word learning task, and we look at how well people learn the probability distributions associated with words in that task, and then how those are transmitted over time. So this is taking a task which is based on work done by Athena Voluminous, where she showed, in this case, adults, these sort of 3-dimensional objects would appear on the screen, and they'd sort of dance around on the screen, and then a label would be provided with those objects. So a verbal label would be provided. So perhaps what you would see is this object, and then 5 of the times you see this object, it goes to the label dup, and 5 of the times it comes to the label neck. And your job is to basically learn what labels go with what objects. So what you're trying to do is figure out something like what the probability is of dup being produced if you're seeing this object. So the reason why this is interesting is that there's been some sort of controversy about what happens when adults, and particularly children, learn aspects of language that have probabilistic variation. So one of the questions is whether there's a bias towards regularization, removing that probabilistic variation from the language and turning it into something which is more deterministic and rule-like, or whether there's a tendency to probability match, to just reproduce the probabilities that you saw during training. And Voluminous found evidence that seemed like evidence for probability matching. So that if you saw these labels 5 times during training and I tested you 10 times, you produced roughly 5 of each of those labels when you're asked to produce labels for those things when I test you later on. We can take this task and produce an iterated version of this task. The way we do this is we initialize chains with different initial frequencies for these 2 labels. So there's always 2 labels. So in one initial condition, there's 0 of these and 10 of these. In another, there's 1 of these and 9 of these, 2 of these and 8 of these, 3 and 7, 4, 6 and 5 and 5. Right? So we just vary the initial frequency, and that's basically what Voluminous did in her experiment. That gives us a way of looking at whether you're getting something like probability matching. So if we just look at the first kind of iteration of this process, where we're giving people these different frequencies during training, and we look at the frequencies they produce during test. Here, the gray bars correspond to the frequencies that were seen during training for these different conditions, and the darker gray bars show the responses of the participants in terms of the frequency with which they produced those labels during testing. And what you should be able to see is that this seems like evidence of probability matching. That there's a good correspondence between the frequency with which they saw something in training and the frequency with which they produced it in testing. And this is basically the data that Voluminous collected, and she concluded from this that adults, when learning these things, basically internalize the probabilities and then reproduce those probabilities when they're being, when they're producing labels for objects. What's interesting is that if you now take the output of these people, the frequencies that they produce, and use them as training frequencies for another generation of learners, and then do that again and again and again, you find a very different kind of story. So here are those 5 conditions which were initialized with different initial frequencies for those labels. And each of these lines corresponds to one chain of 5 learners. And then along the bottom, these are the frequencies that are being produced for those labels, where it counts up the frequency associated with the label, which was the one which determined the frequency for that condition. Right? So condition 0 means you get one label 0 times, the other label 10 times. 0 here is the frequency of the label which is receiving a lower initial frequency in the presentation. But what you should be able to see is that regardless of where we start out, what we're getting is these lines converging to solutions at 0 and 10, which correspond to deterministic languages. Languages in which each label is produced with only one of those objects. So this illustrates a regularization bias. The way that we can check this is by making our sampling model and then in that model calculating what the predictions of the model are about the diffusion of these probabilities over time. So this is what you can see down here. Darker gray corresponds to a higher probability trajectory for the Markov chains that we simulate. Lighter gray corresponds to a lower probability. So here you can see that we have these dark, high probability regions in those regions where these Markov chains are ending up. And we can estimate what the best parameters of a prior are for describing the dynamics that we see in learning here. And the best prior is one which favors regularization. So a prior that says, expect probabilities that are close to 0 or close to 1. And then it's that distribution which gives you the best fit to the human data. So this is a case where there was some controversy about what the kind of bias was. And it's a bias that you can't really see if you look at it in just a single generation. If you look at a single generation, it looks like probability matching. If you look across multiple generations, then you see something that looks like regularization. And so the idea here is that iterated learning is a tool that we can use for trying to diagnose what these biases are and to look at their consequences in ways that might not be expected. Just like in this experiment, every other experiment that had ever been done in function learning used a single generation, and from that they were able to conclude that there was a positive linear bias, but if you look after 9 generations, it's much, much clearer. One thing that's interesting about this model is that it actually corresponds to a classic model of genetic drift, the Wright-Fisher model, which makes similar predictions. Here, this is using a fully neutral model, but we can actually look at mutation processes in that model being equivalent to the effects of priors here. And we can show that you do need a slightly stronger driver towards the extremes to obtain the stationary distributions that we get. So we have other empirical results using those other kinds of inductive tasks that I'm interested in. Things like concept learning, where we know which concepts people find easier or harder to learn, and we can show that those emerge over time in the way that we expect. We've done experiments which try and sort of more rigorously explore the idea that Bartlett was looking at, this idea of reproduction from memory being affected by biases. Here we'd show you these little fish and ask you to reconstruct those fish from memory, and we'd have trained you already on what the distribution of fish in a particular context was, and it turns out that influences the way that people reconstruct them. We've done experiments where we look at people making predictions about everyday events and then actually feed their predictions back to them as data and show that this converges to distributions for those everyday things like the grosses of movies or how long it takes to bake a cake, which actually match pretty well the actual distribution of those quantities, which we estimate from statistics on the internet. And in all of these cases, we get convergence to the prior distribution in the way that we'd expect. So some of the more interesting things we're doing now are looking at cases where we can get some data about universals and comparing the outcomes of these processes of transmission to what we see across different societies. So a nice example of this is using the World Color Survey as a way of documenting what kinds of variations you see in systems of color terms across human societies, in this case non-industrial societies. So this World Color Survey contains data from 110 non-industrial societies showing how people divide up this set of colors shown up here into different terms that they might label in their language. And so what we do in the lab is simulate a process of transmission of color terms where we will, each of these shows a single chain of learners. These first three chains are with 2-term languages, and these are with 3-term languages, and we've gone all the way up to 6-term languages. But the idea is to look at, if we start off with different initial conditions, different ways of partitioning this space, what comes out of this transmission process, and how well does it correspond to what you see in the World Color Survey? So one basic regularity here is that 2-term languages, the more stable solutions are solutions which basically divide up the space by hue. So each of these, by brightness. So lightness. Each of these rows corresponds to the responses of an individual, and each individual is receiving some sample of colors from the previous individual, labeled in the way that the previous individual had chosen to divide up that space. So you get, maybe 3 examples of one term, 3 examples of another term, or I think in these cases it was 6 examples of one term, 6 examples of another term, and then from those you generalize. And this is a small enough number that we can see pretty rapid changes going on in the lab, a large enough number that it provides some constraint and doesn't feel like a completely arbitrary task. But what we see is, if we start out with different configurations for our 2-term languages, we see a general kind of bias towards solutions like this, where the way the space is divided up is in terms of lighter colors versus darker colors. You go back to the original array up there. And in 3-term languages, you see solutions like these ones, where you have basically the addition of a term which picks out the reds, and then the other terms dividing up on something like lightness and darkness. And those are the kinds of regularities that you actually see in the World Color Survey. We have more quantitative analyses where we show that basically in these cases where we start with random configurations, we get a statistically significant increase in the consistency of the languages that people end up producing with the languages that we see in the database, where we measure the distance between the partitions people produce and the partitions that are seen in the World Color Survey. And again, I can talk some more about that if you're curious. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to do was talk a little bit about how we're trying to use this framework to look at another kind of question, which is a question about what might support a process of cumulative cultural evolution. Where here, the idea is to take this simple model and add one thing, which is the idea that each person not only gets information from the previous person, but also gets to make their own observations of the physical world. So now we're stepping outside those cultural objects like language and religious concepts and social norms, which are just based sort of on information you get from other people, and now focusing on something, you can think about this more like science or other kinds of hopefully cumulative processes where you're able to get some data of your own and then think about how it is that we want people to be able to transmit that information to other people in order to make sure that that process actually is something that ends up making progress. So the idea is now what we do is look at different things that could be passed on from one person to another, and with a goal of trying to investigate conditions for cumulative cultural evolution, where we define that as getting closer to the actual process that's producing these data in the physical world over time. What we've done is look at two forms of transmission, which I'm loosely going to call, the first of these, observational learning, where the idea is that what you do is, say you're trying to learn how to hunt antelope. The way you learn how to hunt antelope is you follow around somebody who's an antelope hunter, and you see where they predict antelope will be, right? So in addition to that, you get some observations of your own of where antelope are, and you combine those two things together to draw some conclusions about where you think antelope are, and then go on to make predictions about the locations of antelope for subsequent generations of hunters. So the idea is that this is actually very similar to the original iterated learning case, where you're getting some data in the form of predictions which are based on the current hypothesis that another agent has, and you're just combining those data together with the data which you're getting from the world, right? And we sort of augment our Markov process, and we can prove something then about what the outcome of this kind of process of transmission is. The kind of perhaps surprising conclusion is that if you're doing this, then this isn't sufficient to produce cumulative cultural evolution, because you can think about it in the same terms as what I was showing you before. If you don't have these data, what happens is things wash out and you get back to the prior. If you do have these data which come from the world, things still wash out, and you end up not being any better than if you just observe those data. So what we can prove is that the stationary distribution is one in which the probability that an individual learner selects a hypothesis is just whatever the posterior distribution would be if they observed data from the world. So they're not getting any benefit from that process of cultural transmission. And one way to understand why that might happen is that there's really no way to increase certainty over time in this process. So there's no way, if you have a fixed bandwidth of observation, there's no way for you to know that that person really knows what they're doing and really has sort of nailed down that hypothesis, and as a consequence, you should nail down that hypothesis, right? If you're allowed to regulate how much data you provide, then this doesn't hold. But if you get a fixed amount of observations from the previous person, then there's no way to actually kind of increase in certainty over time. You're just getting some data from another person, you're getting some data from the world, you put those two things together, and there's no way to converge towards what the right solution might be. Another way that you could think about this working is that you're doing something more like transmitting theories, where you're not just communicating something about what your predictions are, but you're communicating degrees of certainty in different hypotheses. And if you're doing that, that actually gives you the opportunity to ratchet information over time. So the way that we analyze this is we just assume that what happens is the posterior assumed by one learner becomes the prior that's used by the next learner, and then it's a trivial result of standard Bayesian analysis that what's going to happen over time is that that posterior distribution is going to converge towards the true process which is generating data in the world. So the idea here is that if you're transmitting information in a form which consists of the hypotheses that you have and how certain you are about those, that's something which allows cumulative cultural evolution to take place. You can prove that you can have weaker things. So for example, if I give you a sample of my hypotheses, I choose multiple hypotheses and I sample them from my posterior probability, my posterior distribution. That's also sufficient to allow cumulative cultural evolution to take place. But the key idea is that you're communicating something which isn't just more data, but it's something which has in it something about what hypotheses you think are plausible and how plausible you think they are, either by declarations of subjective probability or by representative samples from the space of hypotheses. So based on this distinction, we actually do experiments in the lab looking at these different kinds of conditions where we vary the way in which people are able to interact. So I'm going to show you results from 3 conditions. The no data condition means there's no passing of, there's no data from the world. So this is just the iterated learning case that I showed you before. We use a function learning task, so this is exactly the same as those function learning tasks that I previously showed you. There's only a couple of chains in the data I'm going to show you. We now have more, but I'll show you this and give you a sense for what this means. The mixed data case is the case that corresponds to observational learning. Here, what you get are the predictions of the previous person, together with some new observations that come from the world, the true underlying function you're supposed to be learning. And in the theory case, you actually get a message that's typed by the previous person about what they think is going on. They type it into a box, you get to read what's in the box, then you get some new data, and you have to integrate the data that you see with the information that's being passed on through that message. We have 8 participants per chain. And the function which we are having people learn is a quadratic function. Remember I said that those are hard to learn? Well, in fact, people need many more trials than the trials that we show them in this experiment in order to learn this. So if they're able to learn the function, then they need to be able to integrate information across multiple generations to do so. So normally they require like a couple of hundred observations in order to get the quadratic function figured out, and they only get 50 in our experiment. So they have to be able to accumulate information a little bit in order to work out that this is the true underlying function. So if you have no data, this is just the classic iterative learning result that I showed you before. It's displayed slightly differently. So here, the green dots are the training data that participant receives, and the blue dots are their responses. So what you should be able to see here is this true quadratic function that we trained someone on. Here are their responses. They don't do a very good job of figuring it out. And then over time, here are their responses becoming the data for the next person. Here are the responses of the second person. And you can see that what we're doing is getting convergence to that positive linear function. So that's just the case that I showed you before. Now, if we look at the mixed data case, this is the case where what happens is the first generation is exactly the same. Then the second generation, you get a mix, training data of samples that come from the true function and the responses that were produced by the previous person. And what you can hopefully see is that over time, this chain is doing no better than the first generation, right? They're doing no better than the person who was just receiving data from the function and had an appropriate prior, so they haven't figured some stuff out. This is a theory case where what happens over time, you can see they're getting the message in a box, they're also getting the samples from the true function, and over time they actually figure out what the true function is. So these are just examples of individual chains. We can look at the data in a more quantitative way. Here the green lines correspond to the theory chains, the blue are the mixed data, the red are the no data. And this is measuring the distance from the true function as a function of generations. Or we can aggregate the data together and look at the cumulative mean distance across these different chain types. And in both cases you can see that the only people who are really figuring this thing out are the people who are transmitting theories with basically stable behavior in the mixed data case and divergence from the true function in the no data case. Okay, so basically the argument that I'm making here is that iterated learning is something that gives us a nice sort of simple tool for studying inductive biases and maybe things like cumulative cultural evolution in the lab, where we can isolate a single component of that more general process of cultural evolution and pull it out, look at it, study it in a way that's rigorous, and then hopefully turn it around and plug it back into the models that we want to explore. A more general sort of conclusion about processes of cultural evolution is that forces like mutation can actually be a powerful force in cultural evolution. So what those parameters in those models correspond to are basically the parameters that capture the effects of mutation. So in biological evolution, we're used to mutation being a pretty boring process, right? One which is just reflecting errors in random copying. But in the context of cultural evolution, mutation reflects the properties of the transmission process, and it's going to reflect the things that are inside our head. So one of the ways in which things inside our head can influence these kinds of processes is by changing, the probability that you reach a particular conclusion based on the conclusion that the person who's teaching you had, and thus influencing these kind of mutation processes. So there's an opportunity for these mutation processes to influence the outcomes of cultural evolution in a way which is much stronger than the influence of mutation within evolutionary biology. And I think the conclusion for me as a psychologist is one that, when cognition affects culture, studying groups can give us better insight into individuals. Like I said, the thing that gets me excited about this is that this might give us some new tools for answering these classic questions about what human inductive biases look like. New ways of doing experiments in the lab that allow us to figure out what things people find easy and hard to learn in a way that's much, much clearer, if you think about those different examples that I showed you, than the traditional methods of cognitive psychology. It's kind of like having a magnifying glass or a microscope. It takes a small effect and turns it into something that's really big. And when you can do that, that gives you a powerful way of figuring out what those difficult to analyze factors are that underlie human learning. So even though we've mostly been doing this, then we should probably do something more like this. So, thank you.